Hi everyone, welcome back to CALYX Café. I'm a firm believer that there should be more standardization in the clinical trials industry. So I'm looking forward to my next interview with Tania Snioch from GS1. She's Director of Healthcare Operations and she's been leading an initiative to standardize barcodes that we put on our drug kits. I'll be interested to hear from her how they got to where they are now, but also what type of challenges they've faced along the way. I'll see you in a bit. I'm with Tania at CALYX Café. Hi Tania, how are you doing?
Hi, great to have some time with you.
Well, thank you for joining us. So I know it's quite late in the day for you. Do you have a hot drink still at this time of day?
Unfortunately, I always have a hot drink with me, or fortunately. This time I've just got a plain black tea, Irish breakfast tea, nothing exciting.
Well, it doesn't matter as long as it does the job.
That's exactly right. Too true.
So you are directly working in the clinical trials, and your goal at GS1 is to create standards, am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we do. We're a not-for-profit standards organisation. Our job is simply to create standards based on the needs of industry, and our remit is very much about essentially the things that move through the supply chain. So how to identify products, locations, logistics units in the healthcare space, also how to identify recipients of care and care providers. So essentially how to identify a patient as a recipient of care and a care provider as a doctor or a nurse. How to capture those identifiers in barcodes primarily in healthcare, although we do have standards for RFID, and then how to share that information in a standardized way. So essentially we develop standards as industry tells us they need them. And that's the work that I've been doing with clinical trials. The industry came to us and said, hey, we would like to adapt the GS1 standards to meet the needs of the clinical trials sector. And so I've been working with many stakeholders from the sector since 2016 to do that.
And how do you find working in this industry, building standards? Are you facing or have you been facing any challenges along the way?
I think every industry that you work in has challenges, and before healthcare I worked in a range of industry sectors such as the timber industry or the plant growing industry, and clinical trials, yes, has challenges as well. From a GS1 perspective, I think if I can go to the positives first, the biggest positive for the clinical trial sector is that the industry wants to drive standards uptake because they see the benefit. The challenges are that there are so many stakeholders throughout the clinical trial sector who don't know about standards, they don't know about GS1, they don't know about what standards can actually do. Another challenge I would say is capability of IT systems, because GS1, we're not a solution provider. We don't sell barcode scanners or printers or anything like that. We don't sell IT systems. We develop the standards that help those things talk to each other and talk in the same way. So then for our standards to be implemented, we need IT systems to be capable. And so one of the biggest challenges in the clinical trials sector, where not a lot of people have heard of GS1 relative to the size of the sector, then we also need to provide education not only to industry stakeholders, but also to their IT providers to help them and help those stakeholders implement the standards. So IT capability is certainly and awareness is certainly a big challenge also.
Yeah, and you just mentioned stakeholders. So I'm thinking about the supply chain in clinical trials and how many people use a barcode, like all the different locations that kits stop by and where barcodes are read. So how do you get everyone in this supply chain involved in setting up standards?
That's a really good question. And so you're right in that lots of people in clinical trials today use barcodes, but they all use different barcodes with different meanings, with different information in them. So yes, how do you bring the industry together? In fact, for this project and for the work of GS1, it's actually been a couple of leaders in industry, one organisation coming out of France and another group of organisations coming out of the US that went to their GS1, their local GS1 member organisations, GS1 France and GS1 US, and essentially said, you know what, we would like to work on standards. And through industry driving this, they've actually brought together the other key stakeholders that they see throughout the sector that need to be aware. Now, of course, I'm talking about a group of maybe, let's say, 70 organisations, and of course the clinical trial sector is bigger than that, but it's those 70 organisations who are then implementing the standards themselves, who are making others, their peers, their IT providers, their partners aware of the standards, and through that, through experience, through word of mouth, through outcomes and benefits seen from implementation, it drives further and further, kind of like ripples in a pond, across the industry. And that's something after what, nearly 6 years of work in this space, we're really starting to see happen.
That's so great to hear about an initiative like this, making people work together. There are so many areas where we work in silos, so it's very refreshing to actually hear that this initiative is bringing so many different organizations together to agree on standards.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, it's one of the pleasures in working in this sector. If you look at other parts of the healthcare industry, or if you look at other industry sectors, oftentimes a lot of the use of standards is either driven by a big buying organization. So you think about the grocery sector, it's the big retailers that have been behind a lot of the uptake of GS1 standards in that sector. If you think about the commercial healthcare sector, yes, there are absolute leaders in industry who are driving uptake of the standards, but there's also, 75, I think, countries around the world who have requirements where GS1 standards are used, either regulatory requirements or trading partner requirements. But when you come to the clinical trial sector, it's truly industry wanting to do this for the benefit of their own industry and for ultimately the benefit of the patient, the subject in the clinical trials. And that's really kind of heartwarming and nice to see, and a pleasure to work with, to be honest.
Yeah, I totally get that. You mentioned the commercial side. Is there any, or are there any differences between how it's been released in the commercial side compared to the clinical trial space?
Well, in terms of the standards, in fact, because the commercial sector in healthcare has really got a lot of benefit out of using the standards, when the clinical trials representatives came to GS1, one of their real requirements was to align as much as possible with what the commercial sector is doing. So that was really interesting to see, and essentially in the standards that have been developed, particularly the identification and barcoding standard, is very, very almost they're super aligned. There's a couple of small differences that are particular to clinical trials, but very super aligned. In the data sharing standards, there are some things in the clinical trials environment that are very specific to clinical trials, so we have to do something a little bit different for clinical trials. But yes, in terms of the standards and the way that the standards are developed and what industry has wanted, there's very much an objective to align and see the same benefits as the commercial sector. In terms of how the rollout of those standards is happening,